Lesson 7, calls. This is going to be the first lesson we get into with some serious and deep calculations, so I suggest you take notes during this lesson. You may also want to watch this multiple times just to understand what's going on here because there are quite a few calculations involved. So the sales call process. Sales associates travel to a healthcare provider office. The virtual calling is now allowed in some jurisdictions as well, but classically, a sales associate gets in their company car, goes to a healthcare provider office, either in a private practice or a hospital or some other location, and an associate will make a presentation to the HCP, and they will detail one or more products that they are promoting. So what's in their quote bag? A sales associate may have 1, 2, or 3 products that they are promoting simultaneously, and each product has a specific weight that it's given based upon the healthcare provider. Weighting is basically what is more important than the other. So for one doctor, product A may be more important, and another doctor, product B. And this is all done through a process that we'll get into later on. The expression what's in their bag or what's in your bag basically pertains to the products that you are carrying, not physically carrying, although you do have samples, but not that you're actually carrying, but just what you are promoting at that point in time. A presentation is basically a sales pitch with a lot of data and science to back up the claim. So they normally will make a presentation using an iPad or some other kind of visual device, or they can just drop off printed materials. But everything that they drop off or is detailed in the printed packages has been approved by the company, and it's based on the FDA approved label for that specific product. So you're not going to go in there as a sales rep and just talk about whatever you want. And making false claims about the product. You have to detail the product, make your presentation based upon what's been approved by your company and the FDA. Sometimes associates will leave promotional materials with the HCP, some like pamphlets or things like that, and they'll follow up at a later time. A sales associate's main job is trying to convince the HCP to write their specific product to their patients. The reason being is that they think that their product is equal to or better than their competitors' products. This is a blurry line sometimes with companies and sales associates. Your number one focus is on the welfare and the benefit of the patients that take your specific products. So you have to make sure that you are honest and upfront with the HCP when you give your pitch as a sales associate. And the company as a whole needs to understand that their product may not be the best for a specific ailment or condition, but it still may find a niche in some other group of patients. Employees of pharma companies and contractors, you go through so much training on ethics and integrity because you are, in the end, you are promoting a product which is going to be taken by a patient to treat a condition they have. Call metrics. There are many types of call metrics. Some are listed here. Calls per day, days in field, details per call, frequency to reach, time off territory, call types, call plans, and weighted details. Call metrics are calculated over the incentive cycle. Incentive cycles can be monthly, quarterly, trimester. Normally it's a quarter or a trimester, but they can be on a cycle basis, especially for a seasonal product. But you have to understand that the incentive cycle is set up to incentivize sales associates to sell through HCPs for a specific time period, and therefore these call metrics are going to be impactful on the incentive cycle. Many companies look at total RX volume and RX sales share as their only incentive metric, but many times call metrics are also used because you want to have a cost-benefit analysis based upon what your company is doing. Calls per day. Calls per day is the number of healthcare providers called on divided by the sales associate's days in the field. So you want to figure out how many calls per day my sales associates are making. So each sales associate has their own calls per day. Calls per day goals vary from company to company. Mass market associates, you're looking at 5 to 8 calls per day, and specialty associates 3 to 5. We talked previously about what a mass market product is and what a specialty product is. A specialty product takes a lot more time to detail, to call on, because it's for acute illnesses and it's a small subset of the population, where a mass market product such as antihypertension or cholesterol is a broader base and more people suffer from that condition. So you're making more calls per day on that. So the example is calls per day, Take the total calls the sales associate made, divided by the days the sales associate is actually in the field making calls. Sales associates work 4 days in the field in this example, Monday through Thursday. The associate made 35 calls to HCP during this week where they only worked 4 days. So their calls per day would be 35 calls during this week divided by the 4 days that you worked is 8.75 calls per day. You wouldn't divide that by 5 because on Friday the sales associate either took a day off of work, a personal day, they were in training. That doesn't count. A day in the field is a day where you actually are making calls. And that's going to bring up our next metric, which is days in field. A day in the field is any day the sales associate works making presentations to healthcare providers. Training for product or human resources, seminar days are not days in the field. Days in the field goals differ from company to company, but as an industry standard, you want your associates to be in the field at least 80% of the time. You're paying them to be sales associates, sales representatives. If they're spending more than 80%, less than 80% of their time in the field, you are paying them money, or they're not being incentivized properly because they're doing things that are not helping the company and helping themselves. Pharma associates need to undergo a lot of training, and that's why the industry standard is not higher. Other sales associates are spending like 95% of their time in the field and 5% doing administrative work, but it's different in the pharma industry. Once the sales associate makes a call, that day counts as a day in the field. Now, there's a caveat to this because sometimes an associate will make weekend calls. If they make a weekend call, the company has to decide, well, do we really want to count this against the sales associates' days in field? Because if they only call on 1 or 2 doctors on a Saturday and they worked 5 days that week already, now you have a denominator of 6 days in the field, which is going to push their calls per day average down. So you have to understand how your company is going to work with this, and your IT department then, information technology department, has to use that information with their calculations so that they would take this down. It doesn't happen often with associates making calls on weekends. Another thing could be that they're in an in-service day and they only go 6 hours and they have 2 hours left in that day and they decide to make a call. Now they've only been in the field 2 hours that day. So should that count as a day in the field? So all these things are determined by your individual company. Details per call is the number of different products the sales associate talks about during a presentation to a healthcare provider. So if you carry 3 products in your bag and your targeting and your alignment group tells you for this specific HCP, talk about these 2 products in the primary and secondary position, you have then detailed or talked about 2 products on this one call. So you're selling multiple things. Detail priorities vary from HCP to HCP, so every doctor is different in terms of what product could be the primary and/or secondary product if you are detailing more products on a single call. And it's more cost effective to have a single sales associate detail multiple products than to have multiple associates visit the same HCP to promote different products. So if I have associate A who's detailing product A and associate B detailing product B, they both would have to visit the doctor's office. So I have 2 associates that are tied up with the same HCP. But if I give associate A product A and product B, now that associate can detail both of those products to that HCP, saving money. The main issue is that you end up possibly diluting the message. Because if you're sitting there as a HCP, a healthcare provider, listening to an associate pitch a product to you, you're listening to the product pitch, and now you have to listen to a second product pitch. So it does dilute the message because after the first one, you may zone out as an HCP. You may even zone out on the first part of the first message. But that's up to the sales associate to convince and keep the attention of the HCP. Call metrics frequency. Frequency is the number of times your targeted healthcare providers have been called on during a given period. Frequency goals vary from company to company, but most expect sales associates to achieve a frequency of between 2 to 4 of their targeted customers. We'll get into targeting in a lesson by itself later on. It's a large lesson. But if you are told or directed to call on these targeted doctors, which are high profile, high quality HCPs, healthcare providers, you are expected to call on them a certain number of times during the cycle. So if your incentive cycle is a trimester, and your frequency goal is between 2 and 4, that means you should be seeing this doctor 2, 3, or 4 times during that trimester, meaning you should go visit that doctor 2, 3, or 4 times if that's your goal. So in the example, a sales associate has 100 total targeted healthcare providers in their territory. The sales associate calls on 82 of their HCPs, okay? And how they call on them is they made 2 calls to 50 of their HCPs for a total of 100 calls. They made 3 calls to 32 of their HCPs for a total of 96 calls. So what you do is you take the entire number of calls made, 196 calls, and you divide up by the number of distinct HCPs called on, which is 82, and you have a frequency of 2.39. One thing you want to look at also is the caveat is frequency to reach targets versus frequency to total targets. So if you have 100 targets and you only reach 82 of them, you can calculate the frequency based upon the number you reached. If you have 300 targets and you only reached 82 of them, now your frequency is a lot lower because you only reached a certain amount. And we're going to get into reach next in terms of what that is. Call metrics reach. So reach is the number of healthcare providers called on during a given period of time divided by the total number of targeted healthcare providers that are in your territory that you're responsible for. Goals vary from company to company, but you really want to make it reach about 80% of your customers during an incentive cycle. As an example, again here, you have 100 targeted HCPs in your territory. You call on 82 of them. Therefore, you've called on 82 out of 100. So you have an 82% reach. You've reached 82% of your doctors. Now remember, if you call on these doctors only 1 time each, your frequency, our previous metric, would be 1. So reach and frequency are hand in hand, and some companies put reach ahead of frequency as far as importance, and some do the opposite. If you have a low number of targets in your territory, you want to increase your frequency. If you have a high number, you want to increase your reach. That's normally how things work. Call metrics time off territory. Time off territory is calculated as any time a sales associate is not in the field calling on healthcare providers. These days include vacations, holidays, in-service training days. The key here is in-service and training days. Pharma companies try to balance the amount of time that associates are in training versus making calls because this limits their sales effectiveness. And training, obviously, we talked about before, is extremely important, but you want to keep time off territory, the time that the rep is not there to a minimum. Call metrics, call types. So these are the basic call types that you have. With telemarketing, it's a little different now, but the basic call types we have when we're actually going and meeting HCPs are a presentation with a detail. This is when an associate promotes and details one or more products to an HCP, and they may or may not leave literature about that product. Presentation with detail and sample. The associate again promotes one or more products to an HCP. They may or may not leave literature about the product. They will leave a sample with an individual who is licensed to prescribe a controlled substance. The healthcare provider needs to sign for these samples, chain of custody. Our samples lesson is coming up next, but just to call it out here, you cannot leave prescription samples with a secretary, an office staff member, or anyone else who is not licensed to prescribe a controlled substance. Sample drops. This is when an associate drops samples with a receptionist or non-writer. This is no longer an approved type of call for presentation drugs, prescription drugs. The reason I bring it up here is that it was done in the years past, and sometimes looking at sales data, you'll still see this listed as a call type, but sample drops are not allowed. Again, we're going to cover samples in an upcoming lesson. Call metrics, call plans. Sales associates will have several products in their bag, as we talked about. The brand teams, the individual product brand teams, collaborate with the targeting and alignment groups to create a call plan. A call plan pretty much dictates which product the sales associate will promote first and second and third to a specific healthcare provider. Every brand team wants their product to be first in position because as we discussed before, the attention span during a presentation, a pitch to an HCP, over time, the attention span drops. So you want your position to be talked about first. So HCPs have a limited time to talk to reps. Second position products and beyond are considered upselling often because the primary focus was on your P1 or your top product. And getting an HCP to listen to more than one product pitch is always tough. Pharma companies will try and have complementary products in the P1 and P2 positions, meaning that you're going to want to have products that are compatible or complementary. So many people who have antihypertension may also have diabetes, for example. So therefore, maybe your P1 product is an anti-hype drug and your P2 is a diabetes drug. That's for a general practitioner. Now, if you go see an endocrinologist, maybe your P1 product is diabetes and your P2 is antihypertension. So that's how you would try to have complementary products in the same bag for the sales associate. It makes no sense if you're a sales associate that has a diabetes product in your bag that's only approved for people 18 years or older to be calling on pediatricians and therefore have a pediatric drug in your bag. That makes no sense at all. Call metrics, weighted details. So as far as giving credit, an associate does not get full credit for all products discussed on a sales call. Instead, weighted details are used to get an overall score. So when an associate talks to an HCP about 3 products, that does not count as 3 calls. It counts as 1 call with 3 details. A weighted detail is when you assign values to the P1, P2, P3 details to get an overall detail value for that call that can be summarized to calculate the associate's performance. As an example, a sales associate makes 8 calls in one day and details a total of 14 products to their HCPs. For weighted details to be reported, those metrics are combined in the following ways. Example 1, P1s have a factor of 100%, P2s 25%, and P3s 10%. So if P1s were discussed 8 times, that's a value of 8. P2s were discussed 4 times, that's a value of 1. And P3s were discussed 2 times, that's a value of 0.2 based upon the factor involved. So the weighted details for that day would be 9.2. You have 8, a P1 value of 8, a P2 value of 1, and a P3 value of 0.2, which is a total of 9.2. If you wanted your weighted average per call, that would be 1.15, which is taking your 9.2 and dividing it by 8. So these are different ways that weighted details and weighted averages are calculated. I know I threw a lot of calculations at you, but we're going to go over them all now and try to give you an overview of how all of them relate to one another in the next slide. So we discussed a lot of metrics in this lesson. It can be pretty complex and overwhelming. So I do suggest you go back and watch this lesson multiple times. Hopefully you took notes as well. In the last example here, I just want to pull it all together. So in this right here, you're a sales associate. On the left side are your healthcare providers. Those are the only doctors you have. It's a small number, but it's an example. And across the top are the number of calls, details, and the P1, P2, P3 products that you promoted during the call. So if we take a look at this, calls, the sales associate made a total of 34 calls to their 10 targeted HCPs in this incentive period, which is January through March, a trimester. Details, the sales associate detailed 44 total products during those calls. So average details per call. The rep made 44 details during 34 calls. So your average details per call is 1.29. What's your reach? Well, you reached 8 doctors because you didn't call on this doctor and this doctor. So you reached 8 doctors out of a total of 10. So therefore, that's an 80% reach. You've reached 8 out of 10. What's your frequency to the reached HCPs? Well, you made 34 calls to 8 reached HCPs. That was the 8 over here. You missed those 2. So 34, that's a 4.25 frequency. How about your frequency to your targeted HCPs? So you made 34 calls to 10 targeted. That's a 3.4. So you can see a frequency to a reach doctor versus a frequency to a targeted doctor. And notice how that's how frequency and reach are intermixed. Finally, weighted details. You want to look at your P1, your P2, and your P3 for your total details. So you have 34 P1 details at 100% for a value of 34. You have 7 P2 details at 25% for a value of 1.75. And you have 3 P3 details at 10% for a value of 0.3. So you add those together, 34, 1.75, 0.3 for a 36.05. So the associate detailed 44 total products, detailed 44, but their weighted detail is only 36.05. I hope that explains call metrics. We're going to get into this more in further chapters, such as targeting and alignment, but calls are a very calculation-intense type process. Thank you. This is the end of Lesson 7. There will now be a 10-question quiz.